Shalom. Hello again. Well, we're at the point in our 5,000-year saga of the temple story where we had talked about Solomon's temple last week, how it was built with $3 billion worth of materials collected by King David by 150,000 laborers over 7 years' time. And it lasted 4 centuries, but it stood during one of the most painful periods in Israel's history, and that is the period of the divided kingdom. We can look on this map, and it shows Israel of the time with some of the important cities. A line was drawn between Mount Moriah and the holy site of Bethel, an altar that was there in Abraham's time. And this whole area of the north made a separate nation called Israel, leaving the 2 southern tribes here in the south to worship at the Jerusalem temple. In the north they put temples at Bethel here and at Dan in Galilee. So the Galileans went to the temple at Dan and the Samaritans to the temple at Bethel, leaving only the people of Judah to go to the Jerusalem temple. Some northern people still came, but that weakened the nation and it weakened the temple. Ritual worship set in, paganism set in, pagan altars and groves were there at the temple site. King Hezekiah and King Josiah tried to clean them out. You can read these stories in the Bible of how the temple deteriorated. And finally, the nation was attacked, its 2 halves, and the 10 northern tribes were carried off by Assyria. And finally, Babylon came and attacked Judah. And in 586 BC, some 4 centuries or so after the temple was completed, it was destroyed by Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonians. Jeremiah the prophet had forecast that. He was jailed for his prophecy, and in jail he wrote his book of Lamentations. We can see the deportation to Babylon and how ironic it was, because in the first program I drew this orange line from Ur of the Chaldees, where Abraham came from. God took him this direction through the fertile valley of the Tigris and Euphrates to Canaan, to originally settle Canaan. Now the Babylonians carried the people of Judah this way to Babylon, right here. They were taken practically back to where their patriarch had come from in the first place and held there 70 years. But then when the 70-year captivity was over, they painfully began another temple. 516 BC, Zerubbabel laid the foundation. And I'm going to skip on to the time of King Herod, because the second temple really saw its great fruition in Jesus' time and in the 1st century. Haggai, the prophet, had said in Haggai 2:7, "I will fill this house with glory," and it was indeed a glorious place. We can actually see what it took to build this thing. Limestone blocks 30 feet long, workers with levers and pulleys, imagine. And we can kind of see the temple itself too, because in Jerusalem there's a wonderful model of it, and we went there with our cameras one day. Well, excuse me for looking like a giant. I know the feeling now of Goliath of the Philistines. I'm standing up inside the model of the sanctuary, and I thought, while we really have Zerubbabel and Herod's temple, the second temple, right before us, we might see a little of what Jesus did here. First of all, we know of the Eastern Gate. Well, he rode the donkey down the Mount of Olives on that marvelous day when he fulfilled Zechariah's prophecy. "Behold, thy king cometh unto you, just and lowly and having salvation, and riding on an ass, even the foal of an ass." He rode that donkey through this gate down here. The Mount of Olives would be where you are, out there in your chair looking into your television set. You're about at the summit of the Mount of Olives, looking down at the temple site, just as it looks from the top of that mountain. And so he rode down and proceeded through this gate. Now, anyone coming through this gate would enter into huge and empty courtyards here. The court of the women in front, the court of the Gentiles to this side, and over here to the south side. Everyone was welcome at the temple. The Gentiles come today quite regularly. Every tour I take is filled with Gentiles. Well, they are certainly welcome, and they were then. And they didn't go into the sanctuary because, of course, they didn't owe the sacrifices. They didn't have the law, but they might observe the marvelous spectacle of the people who did. Maybe 500,000 people would come on the day of Passover to bring their lamb, to have it sacrificed, to give God his portion, to take it back home and eat it. This was quite a thing to see. They would come in, not necessarily through the eastern gate. The poor people came through the Hulda gates in the southern wall and met at the porticos over there and then came to the sanctuary. The priests came across a bridge, which is behind the whole sanctuary building, difficult to perceive from here, but came to that back tower more or less and entered in their own private entrance. And there are gates all around, the Jaffa Gate and the Damascus Gate and the Zion Gate and the New Gate and so on. Many gates are mentioned in Scripture. By the way, the gates haven't always been the same. As a conqueror throws down the wall and another one rebuilds it, well, the new one puts the gate where it suits him. The East Gate, for example, today is in the same place, but it's closed. The Turks closed it in past centuries just for defense of the city. Well, when a person did enter, though, he entered into a courtyard and he got himself together to do the worship. And, you know, to go into this eastern side, into the sanctuary proper, into the holy place, one had to get his thoughts together. It was difficult in here. It wasn't pretty. It wasn't beautiful. The buildings are beautiful, but death is not beautiful. The blood that was shed, the lambs bleating and crying, the blood on the garments of the priests, of course it was washed away constantly, water, sewage, it was sterile clean, but there's no getting away from all that killing and the sound of it and the smell of it and so on, and it just underlined for the people how critical, how evil sin really was. It wasn't pretty and it wasn't meant to be pretty. Well, the worshiper would progress in here, and there is an altar of sacrifice, difficult to show you because it's much smaller in scale and is behind the main gate here. But I'm looking at it. It has 4 horns on the corners, coals which would always be burning. The altar made of wood and brass. Wood in the Bible is humanity. Brass is judgment. And this is the judgment of humanity. Everything in the building, as God designed it for the tabernacle of Moses, is made of special metals, woods, and colors in keeping with symbolic meanings. Inside the building would be the menorah, the solid gold candlestick, a beautiful symbol of our faith. They lit it once and refilled the oil constantly. Just as we are set afire once, we're saved on one occasion, and then as we walk, we appropriate the oil, the Holy Spirit, and that way we stay brightly lit and the light is seen by all. Inside, too, a table with show bread God called for. Bread just for show, as if to say it's a picture of His Son in the place where He works. God had this picture of Christ, the bread of life, in the tabernacle. Then there was an altar of incense to provide a pretty smell inside. And it's nice that the altar of incense was kindled with coals from the altar outside here, the sacrificial altar with the horns. In other words, everything used inside was pre-sacrificed. It came from coals that were already blood-soaked, that the priest would carry back in a censer and then start the altar of incense inside. And it was illegal to bring strange fire, say bring in burning embers from outside the tabernacle for convenience. When this was done in Leviticus 10, Nadab and Abihu, the sons of Aaron, the high priest of Israel, were struck dead in the holy place. And finally, in the very back of the building, I can't show it to you, I almost don't want to touch it, is the apartment of Almighty God, where He chose to dwell among His people. The Kodesh HaKodeshim, the Holy of Holies, is where He lived. And they knew He lived there because they could see the glow, the Shekinah glory of God when He was in the temple and when the priest went in on the Day of Atonement to meet with Him. One day a year, the high priest of Israel would go all the way back into the Holy of Holies, sacrifice on behalf of himself and of all Israel, the national sins of Israel. Once a year, in effect, their redemption was guaranteed. And so they still greet each other on Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, Lashana Haba Tikosevu, Lashana Tova Tikosevu, let me get it right. May you be inscribed in the book of life, meaning for 1 year. May I see you next Yom Kippur.
May God have mercy on your soul for this year, and I'll meet you again next year, and we'll ask him for mercy again. The priest actually went back to the mercy seat, top covering on the Ark of the Covenant, which was like a big trunk in which they kept the tablets of the law, manna, Aaron's rod. This is what's properly supposed to be in the temple. It's unclear when the temple was destroyed again and rebuilt again and so on, if all of it was recovered. It's unclear where it all is today, but that was the prescription. And the priest took the blood in and put it on the seat above the ark, and God looked upon the blood and he forgave. The blood forgave sin. Leviticus 17:11 says, I have given you the blood for remission of sins. And so the ultimate sacrifice, curiously, just before this temple was utterly destroyed for the last time, was that of the Master, Jesus Christ, sacrificed on this very mountain, and that theme being the final sacrifice. Well, the magnificence, the glory, again, the size, the mere size of the building. If we're looking at about a 4-foot structure here, we must multiply by 50, and we would be looking at a 200-foot structure, like a 20-story building, but a huge building with depth, trimmed in solid gold. There was so much gold in the temple that the candlestick by itself has been estimated as upwards of $200,000 in value. The things inside were not brass and wood. They were solid gold. As you move back to God's chamber, it became clear that the things near him were golden, where the things near men were brass. And in the Ark of the Covenant, in the back room, this was made of gold-plated wood. This is so beautifully a type of Christ because he was humanity and deity together, wood and gold together. Humanity is wood and gold is God. And it's no surprise that he was a carpenter. A carpenter is someone who makes useful things of wood. And so he took humanity, and of us he made some useful things. Well, the people came in throngs. I say 500,000 at a high feast, and that would not be unexpected. They could find lodging in Jerusalem. They had to be here 3 times a year. The first festival season, they would celebrate Passover, unleavened bread, and first fruits. Then they would celebrate Pentecost. I should put dates on these from our own experience. In April, say, the first 3 feasts. Pentecost in June, maybe the first week of June, called Shavuot in Hebrew. And then the fall feasts, trumpets, the Day of Atonement, and the Feast of Tabernacles, all in September or October. The fall feasts would mark the end of the festival year, and then they could wait until next spring. But you see, it compelled you to live in Jerusalem, because if you lived in Rome, you would have to make these 3 trips per year. In the upcoming tribulation, it's curious to know whether they will attract the Jewish people of, say, Los Angeles to come here to Jerusalem 3 times a year, but that is what the law says, and if they build a temple, then it's to keep the law. Well, to go back to our history, this is the second temple. This is the one built by Zerubbabel in 516 BC and enhanced beautifully by Herod. And to give him credit, all of this, as you can see, is Greco-Roman construction. These things, these pillars, these Corinthian tops on the columns and so on, that's Greek, that's not Jewish. But Herod walked on both sides of the street. He pleased his Roman masters, who are Hellenists at heart. They loved the Greek architecture and the Greek poetry and the Greek sports and so on, and they wanted to continue that world. And Herod found a way to have temple worship and Greek construction and beauty and put the 2 together. When Zerubbabel made it, it wasn't so magnificent. Haggai 2, the prophet, weeps and says, the old men who had seen Solomon's temple, which had been destroyed 70 years before in the captivity, they wept when they saw what a modest structure Zerubbabel put up for God to live in on earth. It really was so small and ignominious beside Solomon's first temple. But Herod made it into this. So, and Haggai remarked in 2:7, I will fill this house with glory. And in this temple, in this building as we see it, came the teacher, the carpenter, the one who gave life.
Now we have some interesting footage shot at the southern wall of the temple, and I want to locate that for you. This is the southern wall of Herod's temple, pictured as it was, with people coming in and out, the Hulda gates, the stairs on which the Lord and his men entered the temple and left it, along with the other plain folks of the time. And one day I went there with Ian Stern, our temple archaeologist, and he made a brilliant talk. You'll see me along this edge of the southern wall, sitting up above the stairs. And I must say I had a rather bad throat that day, so my voice won't sound quite right, but I did want to show you this footage and let you see this location and hear Ian teach. Now we're at the center of Second Temple times, and of course you can hear the noise of the road and the construction in modern Jerusalem. But our subject here is pilgrimage. Pilgrimage of the First Temple, the Second Temple, and here the Third Temple. The great religions that are interested in the temple, Judaism and Christianity, are coming to an intersection. With the Third Temple, we understand a completion of the Jewish dream of worship of God again in Jerusalem on Mount Moriah, and of the Christian dream of the second coming of the Messiah, the establishment of the kingdom on earth. So here in the Second Temple site, well, I'm right on the stairs where Jesus and his men exited the temple. We're going to bring on Ian Stern in a moment, our master archaeologist, to take you through the artifacts around me. It's getting so that the Jews and Christians don't disagree very much about this coming of Messiah. The Jews have read that he will be coming to the Mount of Olives. Zechariah 14:4, his feet shall stand that day upon the Mount of Olives, which is on the east of Jerusalem. That's the mountain behind me. And you see many gravestones up there. We've referred to them in past programs. Jewish people buried there to be early in the resurrection, to not be overlooked, to be there when the king passes, as they were there when he came down the Mount of Olives in his first coming in the Second Temple time, and they shouted, Hosanna, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. You know, there's a rabbi that made an interesting statement in one of the news magazines. They were talking to him about Jews who believe in Jesus as Messiah. They call him Yeshu. They emphasize the Jewishness of the Lord, and that's not difficult to do. He was a full-blooded Israeli. And the rabbi said there's room for another kind of Jew. A Reform, a conservative, an Orthodox Jew, everyone knows what that is. A Messianic Jew is something new. A Jew who insists to be a Jew, but he believes when Messiah comes in, it will be Yeshu, and that he came before. And so he calls himself Ami Mishichi, a Messianic believer. These were the kind in Antioch in Acts 11 that were called Christians. These are the first Christians, and there is still a long, thin line of heroes that take that position. Well, what the rabbi said was that there can be this valid fourth kind of Judaism. And so the reporter said, well, do you believe that Jesus is the Messiah? And he said, no, 1,000 times no. But when Messiah comes, if it is Jesus, and he covered that case too. That's total coverage. He's insured whether it is, whether it isn't. That probably isn't the way to go. Probably a solid belief, as Jesus said, "O ye of little faith." Probably a solid belief on one position would be better. But I'll let the rabbi and the Lord have that one out. The surroundings I'm in are so exciting. This is where pilgrims came. They walked these stairs to approach the temple, the Second Temple, the time of Herod, the time of Christ. And I'm going to bring Ian Stern on here to give you the technical details. And I know you're liking this, and he's my friend, and he is a master archaeologist. And this is the real, what they call here, Emet, the truth of the truth.
Here we are on the monumental staircase of the ancient Holy Temple. And it's here that we can best understand, I believe, what it means to make pilgrimage, or more specifically, what it meant to make pilgrimage 2,000 years ago in the time of Jesus. We're standing on the actual staircase that people would have gone up. And in order to understand that whole process of pilgrimage, the 3 times a year that Jews came from all around the world into the holy city of Jerusalem, one must look at the staircase and understand something. First of all, we see they're designed in a certain way. They were constructed with certain, let's say, intention behind it. We see a long step, a short step, a long step, a short step. This staircase is designed to break your stride. So as you ascend onto Mount Moriah, to the Holy of Holies, you are going up and you are going to be introspective. Your stride is broken by the design of the stairs, hence you have a sense of decorum. You're going to go up and enter in through the right-hand gates. As it says in the Talmud, those who go into the Temple Mount will go through the right-hand gates, and they'll come down the left-hand gates, which are on our side over here, the gates of Huldah. If you were in mourning, if you had lost someone in your family, then you'd go in the opposite way and down the opposite way, and people would notice this, and they could act appropriately towards you. Now, we also know from the different sources that as you went up, you sang something. You sang one of the psalms, the songs of ascent. You sang that as you went up, you went in, you offered your sacrifice, and you came down. Now, what was the whole process of pilgrimage? Let's step back for a second. When we look around here, we notice right behind me there are approximately 50 ritual baths, mikvaot. When we read the Bible, we know that Mary goes to a bath before she ascends the staircase. What is she doing? She is purifying herself in the mikveh, in the ritual bath, and then she is going to ascend the staircase, and what is she carrying in her hands? 2 turtle doves, the sacrifice. She's going to carry that up with her, as thousands upon thousands of other pilgrims would have been doing with her, either the turtle dove or perhaps the meal offering. These are the offerings that the poor would have brought with them as they ascended to offer their sacrifice to God. Now, we also know that at this period of time, 2,000 years ago, we're talking about a Jerusalem of 100,000 or more people. The size of the city would have doubled on the pilgrimage holidays, on Passover, on Shavuot, and on Sukkot. On these 3 days, this staircase would have been wall-to-wall people. And the imagery that we get from our sources is wall-to-wall people that look like waves of people ascending the staircase to make that pilgrimage. Now, we have to stop for a second. We have to ask ourselves, why all of this fuss? Why going in through one gate and down another? Why the steps deranged in a certain way? Why singing as you're going up? And the answer is the spot up on top is the holiest spot in the world. That place where the Holy of Holies was, that spot which only one person was allowed to go into, the high priest, once a year on the Day of Atonement, and we're told in our sources that before he went in, he first of all will fast and pray, and then we're told that he ties a rope around his ankle, because if he were to die when he was inside, no one else would be allowed to pull him out. I was getting a sense of how people related to that spot. Hence, okay, we have to think why. And it's because that spot up there is where, according to tradition, Abraham almost sacrifices Isaac. According to tradition, that is where the world is created from. And finally, that is where God has, not had, but has his footstool on earth, according to tradition, where the divine presence, what we call the Shekhinah, dwells, not dwelt, from that spot up to the heavens. Now, we have to take a second and think, what are we doing here? Okay? 2,000 years ago, people made pilgrimage. What was going through their minds? You came from all around the world, whether it was Rome or Greece. You would make that trip, that journey, and it took a long time, not the short flight that we take today. You'd come into this Jerusalem that was teeming with people, and you'd come up these stairs, okay? Before you did that, you might even have purified yourself, okay? You would have received a token after you had purified yourself in one of the baths, and then maybe you would have met one of the different preachers. Jesus and his disciples would have been walking up here. They would have been preaching over here. The 48 ritual baths that I mentioned would have been, or possibly at least, are the baths where we have the baptism of the thousands by Peter. And then you would have ascended and gone in through those gates. Now what's taking place? The sun is at your back. It's at my back right now. You go up the stairs, and then you go into these darkened passageways, lit only by oil lamps, which give a limited amount of light. Your eyes adjust to that darkness, and you ascend. Eventually, you will come up on top, and when you get there, right in front of you is this huge white marble and gold structure, approximately 30% larger than the Dome of the Rock today, and the sun is reflecting off of that white marble right into your eyes. In other words, on a purely physical level, we're talking about having an overwhelming experience. When one adds this spiritual and religious dimensions to that experience and realizes that we're talking about people coming from small little villages all around, then we're talking about having an awesome experience, something that someone would never forget throughout his life. And this, again, was what pilgrimage was for Jesus, his disciples, and all those Jews 2,000 years ago.
The idea of pilgrimage to Jerusalem, started with 3,000 years ago with Solomon's temple being built there, and then people came, the Queen of Sheba came and so on, from other nations. They're still coming, of course, on tours, and in the kingdom to come, It says in Zechariah 14:16, they'll go up to Jerusalem from year to year to worship the Lord and celebrate the Feast of Tabernacles. So it's an ongoing thing. Some of the pilgrims there at the southern wall where Ian was teaching were, of course, in Jesus' time, the Galilean crowds he talked to up there in Galilee with the Sermon on the Mount, the feeding of the 5,000, and so on. In each of those stories, it tells that they were on their way to Jerusalem for a festival. So they would, too, have gone in the gates at this southern wall and walked up those stairs that Ian was showing you and talking about. And of course Jesus and his disciples used those same stairs and that same gate. Well, there's precious video in this series. Obviously we've been going back, picking up footage. We have some new footage. Shalom Yerushalayim. Pray for the peace of Jerusalem.